my lecture.
Oh, are you? Oh, great.
The green economy.
Oh, fantastic.
Of the 21st century, yeah.
Oh, Achim.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me here at the Oxford Martin School.
Pleasure.
We first met when you were Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, which is a post you had for how many years, Achim?
10 years.
10 years.
2006 to 2016.
Fantastic. And now you're in post here at Oxford University. And what's
Indeed.
your brief here at the Martin School?
Well, as a director of the Oxford Martin School, I try to bring two interests together. One, the world of knowledge, science, technology, policy, embodied in the researchers, the professors, the faculty, the postdocs who work here in Oxford virtually on all the frontiers of knowledge. And at the same time, the vision that brought Jim Martin to make this donation to establish in perpetuity a school, the Oxford Martin School, that would particularly focus on 21st century challenges that required more than one discipline, the interdisciplinarity of trying to find answers and breakthroughs to the full spectrum of challenges we would face, and to introduce a strong solutions focus. So these two taken together are the DNA of the Oxford Martin School, and my task, my objective, is to work with the world of research and at the same time enable the Oxford Martin School to be an accelerator, if you want, and a conduit into the market for action, whether in an economic sense or in a political sense. So it's even an element of think tank and advocate, but very strongly rooted in an evidence-based approach.
Fantastic, Achim. Well, we wish you very well here. It's a great role.
Thank you.
I am writing a book, as I've mentioned to you, A Restored Earth, 10 Paths to a Hopeful Future. And I'm trying to set out in the book how we can address the global environmental challenges of our time, but also the social challenges. And I'm going to write about climate change and forests and soils and water and biodiversity and cities and oceans and waste, about what we can do as individuals, but also what we need to do globally to put the world on a better track. And I wanted to start, if I may, with the global questions, given your role. Is the current global environmental governance, international environmental governance, what we need to put the world on a better track, or do we need new systems?
I would still call it as being in the global environmental governance 1.0 phase. We spent the better part of the 50s, 60s, 70s just beginning to comprehend the magnitude of environmental change and impact, whether through pollution, through land resource degradation, forest degradation, but then increasingly also the variables that would make sustainability in the future increasingly challenging if we just continue to produce and consume along the same pathway. So it was really in the 70s that we began to develop the instruments for international environmental governance, whether it was the Stockholm Conference in 72, the CITES Convention, these early international agreements. And I think we've spent the next 20 to 30 years trying to tackle one environmental issue after another with these individual instruments. In 92, they became more strategic: Climate Change Convention, CBD, desertification, land degradation. But apart from the Montreal Protocol, which was one of the early and most daring efforts to make the world appreciate the necessity to act and then mobilize science, technology, and finance across the world to deliver this phasing down of greenhouse gases, I think we have created a landscape that is both too atomized in terms of the issues, and secondly, is not connecting the co-benefits of an environmental success to benefits in the other two pillars or dimensions of sustainable development, the social and the economic. So our challenge right now is to strengthen and develop a new generation of environmental governance instruments and platforms, while at the same time also making the connection between a benefit in one produces benefits in the others, and that makes the macroeconomic case easier. Now in Rio in 2012, interesting, governments did actually establish a United Nations Environment Assembly. Now it is a hesitant and certainly not the equivalent of a World Environment Organization, but I'm not sure that that is necessarily the only way to go. But what we do need is a global forum, and I believe UNEA could one day become that, where all the individual elements of environmental action and necessity to act come together and they are transacted in a much more coherent, much more powerful, much more transparent way, and allow for countries to see the benefits of acting on the environmental issues in terms of both better environments, greater resilience, but also social benefits, jobs, economic development, new markets and technologies. That, I think, is going to drive our agenda in the coming 10 to 20 years.
Thank you, Achim. And also in 2015, of course, we had the Paris Agreement, which has entered into force remarkably quickly, and we had the Sustainable Development Goals, which are imperfect in one sense, but also a remarkable achievement in another. And I wanted to ask for your views on those two agreements, because the argument in the book, in a sense, is that everything changed, or might have changed, in 2015.
Well, I suppose you can look at it as the culmination of a process of evolution and recognition about the limitations of previous efforts, or you can see it as a breakthrough in itself. Now, I would say both is probably the more accurate way of describing it. On the one hand, we framed the notion of sustainable development in 92, but then we created these terrible three silos of environment and social and economic issues, and the economic paradigm predominated in an age where everything was subsumed to this notion that if only GDP would grow, trickle down would help us lift people out of poverty. And, for some it worked, and for some it worked very well. Usually for those it worked best for were actually the richest ones in the world, because they suddenly opened up this enormous market. Globalization and the economically driven development pathways of the last 20 to 30 years also lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but actually also impoverished a lot of people in the name of development. Those people who have had to leave their land, who are landless now, the unemployed, who have no longer jobs in certain sectors because they're not considered to be competitive, and so on. So I think the SDGs are both a recognition that we did need to change two things in a very significant way. One, sustainability is a planetary phenomenon. And therefore, to continue to define the entire development discourse around a north-south, developing economies, both in terms of reality and numbers, but also in terms of a logic, was no longer appropriate. And therefore, the first breakthrough that I think is significant in the SDGs is that for the first time we have not only a global strategy for sustainability, in which every country is being, in a sense, asked to act and can be held accountable for acting or not acting. And secondly, we have the triple helix of sustainable development, namely that the environmental, the social, and the economic, they are woven together throughout these goals. And the people who criticize that there are too many goals or that they could have written them differently, I think that is nitpicking, quite frankly. Yes, each one of us could have written them better, but the person next to us would have said, well, I don't like your version. The remarkable thing is that 7 billion people through the General Assembly and their nation states actually managed to agree. A new agenda, an integrated agenda in which environment is no longer an afterthought, social inequity is not accepted as the price of economic success, and both social and environmental are increasingly acknowledged as being the foundation of economic success. And every country has a role to play and a responsibility. And Paris, in that sense, therefore, is surprising in terms of the challenge of climate change and the history of moving from a scientific phenomenon being discovered and then elaborated on by the IPCC against all the national interests and the lobbying and the enormous challenge of transformation. But the fact that we actually did have the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015, I think further reflects that the world was ready to act on this understanding that we need one another in order to succeed. And we also need to do such dramatic changes that unless we do them in synchronicity and do it in a global context, we would not succeed. And therefore the Paris Agreement is in itself an affirmation of the SDG logic and process, and at the same time it is also, I think, the greatest test of this new era of thinking about development.
Great. And in the book, I'm hoping to describe paths to a hopeful future, and there's a chapter on climate change and renewable energy, a chapter on forests, a chapter on soil, a chapter on fresh water, on biodiversity, oceans, cities, waste, and also a chapter on what you can do individually. And I wanted to ask you for examples in any of those areas, or a number of them, where you feel already in what you've seen, societies, companies, cities, institutions are already showing us what we might be able to do to put things on a better track. And critically, I think how we might scale up such approaches. So if there are any in particular you wish to describe, I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, in some ways, you could probably write an Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the number of volumes you would need for examples, because
Yes.
what I learned in my years in UNIP when I commissioned first the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report to try and look at examples of where valuation of ecosystem service of nature in terms of human benefits, economically measurable benefits was happening. Then the commissioning of the Green Economy report, then the commissioning of the inquiry into green finance. All three set out not with some hypothesis or theory, except that innovation was happening and we needed to learn from what was happening out there. All three have produced, at that moment in time, remarkable surprise in terms of what was already being tested and tried. Now, the most obvious success story of, the last 100 years of modern energy systems is the explosion of renewables into our energy system. Indeed, I would argue we have an energy revolution underway that is unprecedented in the history of humankind. We have, in just 15 years, turned energy markets, business models, and national energy strategies on their head. We now have the opposite of what we had just 15 years ago, where people said we need centralized, heavy capital, grid-dependent technology in order to provide the power. Yes, we need a part of that, but actually what is now creating the fastest and most economical mass expansion of access to electricity is actually renewables. In particularly continents like Africa, where 2/3 or 3/4 of the population do not even have access to electricity, and they're transforming economies in the so-called OECD world. Germany, Spain, Denmark, Portugal, these are countries, with Italy as well and others following, that are surpassing the 25, 30, 40% mark of generating their national electricity demand or supply with renewables, and doing very well. Thank you very much. So that is remarkable. Then the largest solar power installation now happening in Morocco, the largest wind farm on the African continent in Kenya. What we have seen in just 10 years is 4 myths being challenged head-on, and as so often, they were more an expression of those who wanted to maintain the status quo than of the reality of the technology and the economic horizons. One, that we didn't need this technology. Secondly, that it was not mature enough. Thirdly, that it was too expensive. And fourthly, that, well, maybe we could have 5% renewables, but then the grids would implode. All 4 have proven to be completely mythological arguments against renewables. And here at the Oxford Martin School, we have now begun a research project with engineers, physicists, economists, that's called Integrate, and that is looking at how will we manage our national grids when renewables account for 50, 60, 80% of the electricity. And that's the future that we're now looking at, and not in the lifetime of our grandchildren, in your lifetime.
Amazing. And on forests and soil, I remember, I think when I first heard you speak, you were drawing on some of your experience in Kenya and looking at the landscapes in Kenya and how they've managed their forests and soils, and also, of course, their remarkable biodiversity. And I'd be interested to hear more about what you saw there on the land.
Well, again, both science, traditional knowledge, and modern, let's say, ecological or sustainable farming, eco-farming, we can call it many different terms, have already given us thousands of examples of how we can do things better. Because the bottom line is, in the way that we are now practicing agriculture, in the way that our agricultural economy is functioning for the better part of 100 years, it has essentially turned farmers into miners. That is the balance sheet of an industrialization of agriculture, of an intensification of agriculture, of a geographical expansion of agriculture, in order to feed, indeed, many more hungry mouths, as well as many more obese consumers who are basically not getting good nutritional food, but are consuming a lot. The phenomenon of middle classes and the wealthier in the world consuming multiples in terms of calories, and therefore also the whole supply chain of production being changed exponentially by the demand. But the bottom line is our agricultural economy is forcing, on the one hand, the price of food production so low that it is forcing farmers to operate at either an existential minimum or to give up, and therefore go bankrupt, or to practice a system of agricultural production, whether in livestock or in arable farming, that has such an impact that it is actually depleting resources. So we now live in a world where we will add another 3 billion people in the next 30 to 40 years, but each year we're actually reducing the net amount of arable land available for food production. This formula just doesn't work, and therefore reinventing agriculture, but not on the back of the farmer. I think we have to reinvent the agricultural economy, where both the premium for society is not to squeeze the last cent out of a small or medium-scale farming household family, but rather to structure an agricultural economy and market where farmers are both paid for the production of food, but also compensated and paid for the ecological services that they provide to society. Out of that, a wonderful, viable agricultural economy can grow, but it will need significant rethinking, policy reforms from the fiscal, right through to questions about who controls our genetic material, the concentration in terms of both seed, but also herbicide, pesticide, the input supplies in our global agricultural economy have, yes, produced economies of scale, but also forced into an agricultural economy a business model that is making small and medium-scale farmers less and less viable, industrialized farming the only way that this can pay for itself, and leading us into a essentially mining operation of the most fundamental asset we have for life on this planet, which is that 1.5 meter of topsoil on which everything that grows and everything we eat actually depends.
A very powerful analysis, and I want to come back a bit later to the issue of food waste. I know that's something that you're also interested in and active in. But if we could turn our minds to two other big issues. First, one is oceans and the marine environment, and how to address the particular challenges that we have of governing the marine commons, in a sense, and then also on cities. But if we could start with the marine environment. We've had some good advances in recent years, marine protected areas, better fisheries practice and the like. Nevertheless, the challenges are huge, and I wondered whether what you felt was the best way forward in terms of managing the marine environment better and more sustainably.
The 20th century was an unprecedented assault on the world's oceans and, if you want, on marine ecosystems. And in less than 100 years, we have managed, through the industrialization of fisheries, so to speak, depleted or used our fish stocks to the point where roughly 80% at maximum offtake level are actually imploding. Now that's extraordinary. Just in 100 years, when you think that the Holocene lasted 11,700 years, which is the era leading us up to now. Secondly, we have also assaulted the oceans in terms of not realizing that everything that we produce terrestrially can potentially end up in the oceans, whether it is in the form of runoff, creating deoxygenated zones. I mean, an innocent farmer using nitrogen and phosphates to grow more food did not realize, as we did not collectively until perhaps 30, 40 years ago, that all of this stuff, all this chemistry, ends up draining into the rivers into the oceans, and there it suffocates life. So now we have this phenomenon that in certain parts of the year there are literally thousands of deoxygenated zones where there is no more oxygen left in the sea because of the runoff activities from production on land. plastics. There was one headline recently that claimed that by 2050 there'll be more plastic in the world's oceans than fish. I mean, however one might measure that, just the image should make us sit up and realize this is really an assault on probably a system that even now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we hardly comprehend in terms of its ecological dynamic, but also in terms of the centrality to our well-being. With climate change, obviously, our eyes have been opened to the vital importance that the oceans have played in terms of sequestering and storing carbon. But now, with oceans warming, pH levels changing, we are not only facing the phenomenon of sea level rise, we are actually affecting life in the oceans, and therefore how oceans will function also into centuries into the future. Part of the difficulty here is that, up to now, oceans seemed like a cornucopia. And if you are a human being standing somewhere along the coastline and look out into this vast expanse, it is difficult to think that, there is a problem. Modern science has now allowed us to understand this, and unfortunately the governance of the oceans has had some good moments, such as with the original intention and also articulation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which particularly focused on high seas. And then we have the economic exclusion zones where countries have sovereignty and can put in place measures. But if you look at how governments have failed in their responsibility in the last 15 to 20 years to evolve that United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, not only in terms of regulating the free access to the high seas, but also to maintaining and protecting it, there has been an abysmal failure, because what is dominating governments in their national interest is to actually maintain an open access regime to exploit the oceans, whether in mineral terms, in fisheries terms, or otherwise. And there is an urgent need for the world community, the United Nations, citizens, to realize that unless we can agree on an ocean governance framework, we will have a tragedy of the commons that is, at least in geographic and ecological terms, not comparable with any other phenomenon that I can think of.
Very, very clear. Cities. There's a lot of focus on national governments in all of our deliberations, and yet some of the most exciting things, arguably, that are happening at the city level or the city regional level. And of course, we are an ever more urbanising population. And so I wanted to ask you on that issue also where you see greatest cause for hope and action.
Well, there's perhaps 2 or 3 issues that illustrate the vast array or spectrum of possibilities that cities provide to us at the beginning of the 21st century. The first one is just access to services, right? I mean, if you are somebody who lives in the heart of Africa today, in the rural economy, you have no electricity, your health post is probably 10 to 20 miles away, water has to be collected from a river. Just the difference between being able to move from your rural dwelling that is disconnected from the sort of modern service infrastructure into the city, where you have access to electricity, to education, to clean water and sanitation services, could be dramatic. But here already comes one of the challenges. Cities are not paradise by definition. In fact, inequality and therefore absolute squalor and misery in the cities have become part of the 20th century story of urbanization. And I think one of the challenges we now face in 21st century urbanism and the conceiving of the metropolis is how can people of different backgrounds, who are essentially all migrants, because people are moving into the cities, all come from somewhere, whether across borders or just from somewhere else in the country. How can we create an urban infrastructure that does not turn its eye like in the industrial era where the poor lived downstream of the factories and that's where the smoke and all the rubbish went, and the wealthier ones lived up on the hill and upwind? That concept of urbanization has to fundamentally change. Now, what cities also represent is a significant potential for resource efficiency. But again, it's not automatic. If you take somebody who moves from a rural economy somewhere in Europe or perhaps in Asia today, the first thing that happens when they move to the city is they consume 4 times more electricity or power than they did before. So unless we can decouple or change the nature of energy production in such a way that we can make clean energy part of this equation, we will actually compound the problem rather than have resource efficiency gains. And finally, an example of the frontiers of technology that lie ahead of us. Autonomous driving, mobility, electric vehicles. I don't think we are that far away from cities that will finally allow us to be mobile again, because most urban centers today are a sad example of having allowed ourselves to be led by technology to not become more mobile, but to stand for hours in traffic jams, or to be squashed into public transport systems during rush hour that is more akin to a sardine being put into a tin. Is this really necessary? And I think one of the things we're studying here at the Oxford Martin School, and a task that I've taken on by chairing the Agora Council on the German transport transition and the future of mobility in Germany, is to actually look at this concept of mobility, of regaining a quality of being able to move from A to B, whether as a person or your goods, that takes advantage of technology. And if independent driving, autonomous driving, for instance, can cut the number of vehicles we would need by 30-50% in the future urban centers of the world, we would actually be able to get from one side of the city to the other in a quarter of the time it now takes. That, alongside with a different view on the expansion and development of public transport infrastructure, the internodal, the connection also of individualized transport, collective transport, those are fantastic frontiers that I think cities promise us. But let's remember, much of what will happen in the next 30 to 40 years will essentially double the stock of urban infrastructure. So again, cities are not isolated economic entities. They have a hinterland. They are supplied by ecosystems that are upstream, and they're impacted by the waste that is produced by cities downstream. It is, one of the phenomena that people in a city lose their sense of where nature provides for us. So water comes from a watershed, not a water tap. Water does not disappear down a drain in a toilet or a wash basin. It actually ends up back in swamps, in ecosystems, in rivers. We can either manage that hydrological cycle, and then cities can really become a way of decoupling our impact in terms of water use, or they can become a terrible driver of destruction in terms of water quality, water availability, and much that goes with it. So, and again, enormous opportunity, but choices need to be made, and the choices will not happen just by themselves.
Thank you, Achim. That's very clear. And just as you've mentioned water, it reminded me that prior to UNEP, you also played an important role in mediating the whole issue of dams globally. And I wanted to ask briefly, before we enter into a discussion of waste, and my final questions on politics and the future, about freshwater management in the future, and whether we are seeing a transition globally towards more integrated forms of water management, water resource management, or whether we are still pursuing, in some respects, the water policies of the 20th century, including often very large dams, whose viability in the future climate is not as assured as it has been in the past.
Water has been an issue that many who have thought about the development challenge of the future have been pleading with the world to pay more attention to for the past 30 to 50 years. We've had World Water Commissions, we have World Water Councils, we have international panels of experts. It is one of those strange phenomena we already have in parts of the world where people are essentially looking at empty rivers, or looking at no more underground or groundwater supplies. They basically do manage water much more efficiently and effectively. I mean, in Australia, farmers can, in part in Murray-Darling Basin, earn more money by selling the water rather than using it for growing crops. Now, whether that is the optimal outcome, one can debate, but there is just a signal of how water has become a scarce commodity. We have desalination plants springing up around the world, using an enormous amount of energy, particularly in the Middle East, where fossil fuels have been cheap, therefore the cost, so to speak, seemed low. Some believe that, desalination is the answer, and we will be able to produce as much water as we want in the future. Well, so far the energy and cost matrix does not add up. In addition to that, we will have variability become an issue. So climate change is likely to fundamentally change patterns of hydrological flows. So for infrastructure, such as dams, we will have to deal with a future that is so unlike the past, both in terms of assumptions about how much water seasonally will flow, extreme weather events, be they droughts or floods for that matter, and therefore the viability of operating existing dams and even relying on large-scale dams and storage in the future becomes a much more uncertain business. Now, given that these dams, large dams, cost billions of dollars, I think we will probably see less and less of them being built because they're just too big a bet to take on too uncertain a future that relates to this variability in terms of the consequence of global warming. Now, we also find places in the Middle East where water is now recycled 7 or 8 times, including in parts of the UK, out of sheer necessity. The economics make sense. So we have many opportunities to choose different pathways. What is quite clear is that for the world as a whole, and that then touches on energy infrastructure, because power stations need water, food production, food needs water, we are going to come under a lot of stress because already in the next 5 to 10 years, more than a third of the world's population will be living under conditions of water stress. That means just not enough water to supply them with over a year to meet their minimum needs, be they per capita now in terms of consumption, including industry, or just people who will have to move because there's no water. That can produce many, many consequences, shutting down power stations. We've had that situation in Europe in the early 2000s. Pastoralists and nomadic populations having to move into areas where they will clash with sedentary agriculture, insecurity over shared and transboundary river basins. I don't want to draw up a nightmare scenario because I think more often than not we have learned in history to cooperate over water, but we will need a great deal more sophistication in managing the kind of stress that we will face in many parts of the world over water, access and quality of water than in the past.
Thank you, Achim. I'm sure you're right. In the concluding section of the interview, if I may, I have a few questions of a different order for you. One is about what one can do as an individual, the sorts of decisions one can make. So I think a lot of people feel very powerless about the environment, but a lot of people reflect on doing things and what one can do at an individual or community level. So I'd like to ask you about that. I can't resist a question to you about the politics of the environment and how we make the political case for greater environmental action, and any reflections that you may have on that. The issue of Trump there raises itself, and you may or may not wish to comment on how best to make an environmental case to President-elect Trump. We mentioned food waste at the outset, and I know that you're active on that, so I'd love you to talk about that. And then I suppose my final question is one about what keeps you going in all of this, and what gives you grounds for hope and optimism? And you've done so much, but sometimes it can feel very overwhelming. And I wanted to draw you out on your biggest grounds for hope, because I'm trying to write a very optimistic and hopeful book without pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. I also had a question to you about the faith community and what that's meant, the fact that the Pope and other religious leaders have spoken up. So that's 5 or 6 questions for you. You don't have to answer all of them, but some of them would be great to draw you out on those. Perhaps starting with, as you like.
Let's start with what can we do?
Yeah.
Care. I think if you don't care about what happens next, you're unlikely to do anything. Now, caring itself is not yet having an effect. So, wherever you are, sit down write down on a piece of paper how many decisions a day you take that you think you could actually take differently, and by so doing, cause something else to happen. Now, it may still seem irrelevant whether you use your bike or not in terms of global warming. But imagine if 7 billion people reduced their fossil fuel consumption by 20% in just 1 year because they switch their transport mode. This is where we as an individual need to, first of all, understand that we actually have dozens of choices we make every day. If we inform ourselves about which choice is the more benevolent or the less impactful, then we just need a little bit of intellectual or brain power to start doing the math and say, okay, well, if I do it, my whole school does it, if my whole neighborhood does it, if my country does it, and then the others join, we can actually have a real impact. And I think that is also becoming so much more easy because we live in the digital age. I can find out so much now just by sitting in my chair and taking my smartphone and asking hard questions. And, we're a couple of years away from being able to walk down, a shop, supermarket aisle and, just hold up our cell phone and look at what's the track record of this company. Whether I'm a wealthy consumer or a less wealthy consumer, I buy things. If I don't buy them, that company doesn't sell them. They'll either go bankrupt or they'll start doing things differently. And we've seen the power of that.
Very powerful.
And that then translates right up into, becoming actively engaged. I mean, whether it's in an organization or in your business as an innovator or by electing and caring about the politics of your country. So I think there's thousands of things we can do. And, this is not theory anymore. I mean, let's look around. We have an environmental movement, we have a human rights movement. There are millions of people who are engaged. And even those who don't walk around with posters and banners, sometimes our grandparents were, in a sense, more faithful environmentalists in the way that they used resources. And here comes the issue of food waste. It's always fascinating that older people who lived through hard times cannot believe how callous young people are in terms of throwing away food. And it has become one of my issues of passionate engagement to address this absurd number of phenomenon that in the 21st century we are producing food in unprecedented quantities, and yet at the same time we are also losing and throwing away more than 1/3 of everything we produce every year. That is not only ecologically or socially, but also economically just an act of insanity. And it is just a deep failure in terms of awareness and markets and pricing that this phenomenon is allowed to persist. And again, everyone can do something about this. Now, you asked me also about the politics of environment. I think that is where I think we will now have to continue this journey, which, I personally have very much with many others pursued under the notion of the transition towards a green economy. The issue about the environment is not to separate it out from everything. The environment is the foundation of life, of business, of success, of jobs that are produced, but also of problems, of costs and ill health and sickness. So we need to work towards a macroeconomic understanding of the benefits of looking after our environment, because it is what will drive development. It is what will make people either healthier or sicker. 7 million people dying prematurely of indoor and outdoor air pollution every year is an indictment in the 21st century on the way our economies rationalize something that is just not either justifiable nor is it necessary. So understanding that there are often ways in which we can get an environmental benefit by also combining it with other benefits. Let me take you into the domain of unemployment, jobs. Here at the Oxford Martin School, we are studying the impact of automation on future job markets. My colleague Carl Fry's latest work indicates that up to 40% of existing jobs may be affected by automation. So 3 billion more people, more automation, where on earth will people find work from? So here we are, our taxation system does something very strange. At a time in which we, as societies, want to encourage employment and job creation, the thing we tax the most is actually work, jobs, income tax. And I've long been asking and calling for and looking for allies in the public policy sphere to pursue this notion of an ecological tax reform, where we are essentially shifting the taxation burden away from the factor of labor and income and employment, thereby making jobs more attractive again that have people in them, because they're cheaper, not at the expense of the employee, but to the employer. And at the same time, start inserting a fiscal DNA into our taxation policy that rewards cleaner production and actually sanctions or punishes with higher taxes dirty production, which causes costs. So you can argue for an ecological tax reform as an environmentalist, but you could equally say, here is an example of how two problems can be solved with one measure and have co-benefits of an extraordinary promise and of urgency for all of us. So that is in part political economy, public policy, and politics also. And we have, I think, found ourselves for far too long now, which in part to me explains also some of the voting reflex behavior we now see in recent elections or in referenda here, where people are fed up, quite frankly, with being told by experts that we don't have a choice, that either globalization and international trade or the financial system demand that we submit ourselves to the rules of the financial market or of the global trade regime. I think the time has come where people have said, look, I don't understand what these people are saying, but what I will not take any longer is that I'm told I have no choice, and the only consequence of the choices being made for me are actually that others are getting a great deal out of it, while I don't seem to be benefiting from it. So we have, in a sense, a moment of disenfranchisement that has come through this globalization, the abstract rule-making that is translating into a person's daily sense of, well, I don't like what I'm seeing, I can't deal with this, and they tell me this is the only way to do it, it's time somebody actually turned this upside down. We are now paying a price for that. You cannot dictate to people things that are ultimately a matter of social and political and societal choice. The kind of levels of inequality we tolerate, the kinds of destruction and environmental price we are willing to pay for, or in the name of progress. In that sense, I think, yes, we have some very disturbing political times ahead of us, but we should also understand that they are perhaps part of a corrective that is not manifesting itself in the way I would have wished for, but that is certainly making me sit up and reflect on what has gone wrong and where have we got reason to pause and rediscover the right to choose the kind of development, the kind of society we want.
Including a much sounder, more environmentally sympathetic
Absolutely.
economy, a circular economy too, to some degree. Are you optimistic? What keeps you going in all of this, Achim? And where do you see the greatest cause of hope?
I have just spent the better part of 20 years leading institutions and processes where I have met people literally in all corners of the world who are demonstrating that better ways can work. So first of all, it is just the sheer number of people who are providing us with ideas, with innovations, and are actually saying we can do it better. It's an enormous potential to draw on. I also lived through 10 years in Europe where I saw the issue of climate change move from, this will ruin our economies and, it's somebody else's fault, to seeing the Paris Agreement. I was able to help bring about the Minamata Convention on Mercury, one of the great examples of a tragedy staring us in the eye in the world, not willing to act on phasing down mercury, which has given so much suffering to so many people. I've seen the Montreal Protocol, the most successful treaty in environmental terms, just renew itself and help the world possibly gain the capacity to lower global warming from a business as usual scenario by 0.5 degrees. I've seen the green economy mushroom in terms of concepts around the world, and I think just lots of examples of how good and evidence-based information can help to shape public policy and better decisions. And now I sit here in the University of Oxford, where basically in 2 square kilometers there are 4,000 to 5,000 professors, post-docs, faculty, who are working on everything from quantum computing to the medicine of tomorrow, perovskite technology for photovoltaics, autonomous driving, new economic models, the plants of the 21st century that will feed us. And I'm sitting in an institution whose task it is to essentially accelerate that research and help it bring solutions to people who can make choices. So, in the words of Jim Martin, who founded this school with the University of Oxford, this could either be our worst century or our best century. And I certainly see enough to make me believe the best century option is still one that we have very much within our grasp.
Achim, that's a very good note on which to end. I'm very grateful to you for the interview, and if I may say, all that you've just said so eloquently is very much the spirit I wish to, and the substance I wish to convey in the book. But if I can do it 100th as well as that, it will be a pleasure.
You know it well, and if I can give you some sense of validation, I think that's probably what such an interview or discussion can do, then so much the better for it, and good luck.
Thank you, Achim. Very
When will it be published? So
well, we hope next year.
Next year, yeah. So you have to do it as you go along.
Yes, exactly.